Hey guys, it's James from Via Vita here, and in this short video I'm going to talk to you all about habit forming. We're going to look at some potentially healthy habits, we're going to talk about identifying and isolating potentially not so good habits so that we can alter them into better habits for the future. All of this is going to help you build long-term sustainable success for your overall health and well-being. So I look forward to seeing you in the video. Okay, so it's important to identify first and foremost what actually is a habit. And a habit, very simply, is a behavior that we execute on a regular or consistent basis. Now, it's worthwhile saying that habits can absolutely be good, they can absolutely be not so good or negative or in fact bad. And most of the time, the intention when we talk or when we think about habits is to create positive ones that we think can improve our life. Very few people set out and get up every day in the morning and think, okay, what ways can I build negative or bad habits? But fundamentally, we need to realize that a habit and a behavior is split into a couple of sections. The first section, maybe about 20%, is the mechanics of what it actually is. So what do we do? What does the behavior look like? But 80% of the habit is driven by our own psychology and our own thought process and our own emotions connected to why we are performing that habit. So that's an incredibly important point to think of, because as I said, most of the time we want to create good habits, positive habits, in order to accelerate our life forward. But we have to realize sometimes that our emotions and our psychology can potentially be driving a different thought process and actually building a potentially bad habit. So that's the most important part to realize initially, that a habit is 20% mechanical and 80% psychological. So when we're looking at habits, it's really important to understand that we can't actually extinguish a bad habit or a habit that's been built. All we can actually do is develop it and change it, and hopefully building a better habit moving forward. And the way to understand this is to really look in a little bit more depth at what a habit looks like. And we have something called a habit loop, which is very simply a cue, a routine, and a reward system that allows us to really see what that habit looks like. So if we take, for instance, a habit that we might think is potentially not so great, which might be snacking on junk food. If we look at the cue is any form of time, emotion, pattern that we've done before, something that triggers our initial behavior. So the cue, for instance, might be hunger, it might be stress, it might be boredom, it might be an emotional response to someone we see. And that cue initially brings us towards the routine. The routine is the behavior itself. So for instance, if we are hungry, because we're stressed or we're tired or we're potentially bored, the routine might be that we reach initially for the cookie jar or for the biscuit jar or for the bag of crisps or for the food that we think gives us the reward, which is initial response of energy, a spike in insulin levels, an initial short-term gratification reward. But then what we sometimes don't identify is that once that initial reward is subsided, we actually get a drop off of energy levels, we get a lack of a feeling of satiety, we then start craving more and more junk food, and we go back round to the cue again. So that is the habit loop. It's incredibly important to really understand what that habit loop looks like for any good or bad habits that you have, in order to then understand, okay, well, how can we tailor and change it? Now, once we've identified the habit loop, had a look at it, really analysed, there is a framework for changing the habit. As we said, remember, you cannot extinguish a bad habit. We can only change and alter and develop it and hopefully turn it into a good habit. But in order to do that, we need a framework. And that framework is encompassed by 4 steps. The first step of which is the most important one, which is identifying the routine. Because remember, the routine is the actual behaviour itself. So that should be quite simple for us though. With any habit we have, there's going to be a routine connected to it. So that routine might be binge eating. It might be watching too much TV and not being productive. It might be smoking. It might be drinking. These routines should be the kind of the real key elements of our habit, and what we're doing is that specific behavior. So point number 1, identify what that routine actually is. Point number 2 on the framework is experimenting with rewards. So as a very simple example, if you're someone who regularly craves sugar, that might mean shifting away from eating a biscuit or a cake and potentially eating an apple instead, and something that gives you a potentially a better version of that sugar craving that you have. What this does, by experimenting with rewards, you can actually isolate the real reward that you're craving rather than the one that your brain may potentially think you're craving. And this is absolutely essential for re-engineering a habit and altering it and taking it from a bad habit to a good habit. Point number 3 is then obviously isolating the cue. And this is why some habits are incredibly difficult to quit. So smoking, for instance, has multiple cues. It makes it very difficult to fully isolate. But some of the things you can do in order to isolate a cue are to really ask yourself a few simplistic questions. So for instance, when you feel like that cue is potentially coming up, you might want to ask yourself, what time is it? Where am I? Who is around me? What emotional state am I in? What immediately preceded my urge to have this cue? And all of these questions are going to paint a picture for what that cue looks like, which is ultimately going to be the best thing you can do in terms of isolating it and narrowing it down so we can alter that cue moving forward in the future. So as I said, asking yourself those questions: where am I? What time is it? What emotional state? Who is around me? What preceded my urge for this cue? Those are going to be the main elements that are going to help you really isolate what your cue is. And finally, point number 4 on the framework is having a plan to move and change that habit. And a very simple way to do that would be to have something like an implementation strategy. And an implementation strategy is very much an if and then process. As a very simple example, you could say, if I have an urge for sugar, then I'm going to have an apple. As a really simple example, it's identifying, if I have this urge, what am I going to do? Putting that plan in place, making it visual, making it simplistic, making sure it's tailored to you and not to anyone else. Because the most important thing with having any plan to change a habit is it's individual and personalized to you. A framework that may potentially work for someone else doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to work for you. So when you build that plan, make sure all of those specific elements are truly specific to you and they're not what you're being told by someone else. Again, as I said, as an example, if I have a craving for sugar, then I'm going to have an apple instead. Something as simple as that. It could be a statement. I would also advise that if you're able to write it down or make a note of it and put it somewhere, that's also going to help you to see it from a visual perspective. So in summary, with regards to habits, guys, we know that it's important to understand that we can't truly extinguish a habit. We can only develop or change and move it into a better habit. It's also important to remember that only 20% of the habit is mechanical in terms of what we do. 80% is actually driven by our mindset and our psychology. We know that the best way to identify a habit is to actually look at the habit loop. So the 3 points, cue, routine, reward, are really going to paint a picture of what that habit actually looks like and what is going on inside that habit. And then we know finally that once we've identified what that habit is, in order to improve it or change it, we need a framework. And that framework follows 4 simple steps, which is identifying the routine, experimenting with the rewards, isolating the cue, and then having an implementation strategy and a plan in order to shift that habit from negative to positive. We hope that helps, guys, and we'll look forward to seeing you very soon. Take care.